This book is an excellent debut novel. The writer writes it with compassion, it's very thoughtful, and she really makes her characters come alive. You really feel the pathos and the internal struggles that the characters face in this book. Hi, I'm Anna from Post Me a Book. And as you see, today I'm talking about We're Birds of Uganda by Hafsa Zayyan. It is a debut novel. It is her debut novel, and it is set in Uganda and in Britain. It is an emotionally layered book, and it's not complicated in any way at all. She writes very straight, and it took me about a week to read, which for me is a world record. But even if it was what I would call a short book, in the sense that it took me a week to read, I'll definitely say worth reading. It takes on such topics as identity, both the self-identity, cultural identity, talks about migration, faith, belonging, home, duty, and it also talks about how our history shadows our lives and affects us, whether we want it to or not. It moves between Uganda and Britain in the past and the present, and it also takes out how political decisions forced us to change our lives, or otherwise influences us to change our lives, one or the other. At the heart of it, this is a story about moving between different worlds and not always belonging. So the book is about Samir, our protagonist, who is an Asian, British South Asian, and he's born in Leicester and grew up in Leicester, but now works in London as a lawyer. He's about 30 something, and on the outside his life is quite settled. He's doing well, he's independent from his family when it comes to financial matters. He's up and rising, he's got a group of friends who meet quite often, but internally he has struggles, and part of it is that at the beginning of the book, this group of friends is also splitting up, and he's being given a promotion himself, which means that he's got to go to Singapore, and it will probably be a 2-year job. So he's got that, although he's looking very forward to it, he's got that internal struggle of having to tell his parents. So for him on the inside, he has these internal struggles. He's also someone who, although he's South Asian and he practices his faith, he doesn't feel very rooted to some of the things that are part of his culture and some of the things that are part of his faith. And he feels disconnected about where he really truly belongs. So this book talks about his struggles. Samir travels to Uganda, and when he travels to Uganda, this opens up the parallel story of the past of his family that went to Uganda, moved to Uganda, but were expelled during the time of Amin. And this opens up the other story, as I said, and this other story is about Hussein, who is a previous relation, either his grandfather or his great-grandfather. I haven't quite worked it out, the 60s. Well, he's a relationship anyway, a relative. And Hussein, he moved to Uganda during turbulence in India. I think it was turbulence between India and what is now Pakistan, and of course during the time of the British. So when Hussein came to Uganda, he really adopted it as his country. He became a part of it. He made his life. He lived like a lot better than he would have in India, and he was happy. But he also faces internal struggles that come in within the book, about where he belongs, where his roots are, what his identity is. So that's also taken up in this book. Hussein was very embedded in his society. It was always a strong part of him, and it was his core. But he's always been considered part of an outsider, even if for him, Uganda was him. So the story moves back and forth between this past life and Samir's present life, so both between Uganda and the UK. And it shows how displacement doesn't end when you cross borders, but it echoes throughout your life, and it has its ties and its roots within you. It even echoes within families and family identities, and even within the silence. That this actually comes up when we see Samir talking to his family, or trying to talk with his family. One of the striking ideas of this book, one of the striking themes, is that it takes up, as I said, belonging and exile, where we see that Samir, although he's British, he doesn't British Asian, he doesn't actually feel very rested within his own culture, or perhaps not within his own culture. He's got his own identity that might differ from what his parents' cultural identity is, and he accepts some of it, and other things he's always been questioning. And this makes him wonder who he is. So his family, as I said, and for Hussein, his family belonged. Hussein lived in Uganda as he came up. He had a Ugandan citizenship, but he was never allowed to stay. So this book asks, what happens when the place you love, and you know is a part of you, is also reminding you that you don't quite belong, or you don't quite fit. Where are you in all this history? And then the book also, that brings us also to what the book talks about, which is identity and inheritance. Samir carries the story. We see in the end that he carries the story of his family background, but he also sees a kind of hypocrisy by looking at the past history, looking at his family, and looking at how he feels. So it's not just through the stories, but it's through the behavior, and I guess through fear and expectation, because as his dad also kept telling him, we stay, or perhaps as Hussein also said, we hold our culture, we hold ourselves among ourselves, our own community, because that's what keeps us strong, that's what keeps this culture going. But Samir, as we see in the book, also questions this hanging so hard onto a culture, never trying to expand it. I guess this is where he actually finds there's some kind of hypocrisy as far as he's concerned. The other thing that the book takes up is the theme of faith and doubt. It talks about faith, but not so greatly. It's kind of a quiet acknowledgement that faith is an important part of us, but it also takes up faith where we follow our faith or follow our religion, whichever you want, and whoever you might be, or don't follow our religion, as the case may be. But in this case, for Samir, he follows his religion without always thinking about what it actually means for him. He follows his religion because he was brought up this way. So he fasts, but he also has these conflictions about his religion. And part of this is brought on about people around him who don't quite understand what it's all about. And because he's surrounded by people who don't have the same religion as him, it's not that he questions it, it's just that he doesn't question it, I guess. He doesn't question, why do I do this? So he just follows it blindly, kind of thing. And for him, that's also conflict. So it makes him very human. And the book itself, because it allows this kind of doubt and belief of religion to coexist, it becomes very part of the now time, where people probably always question their faith, but of course, faith is not quite or the churches are not always as strong as they used to be these days. We also see, when we're talking about Hussein's part, or when the book takes up Hussein's story, that there is the theme of political violence and trauma, which is what happened to the Asians, the Ugandan Asians, when they were expelled by Idi Amin. And we find that for Hussein, as I say, his identity is really questioned during this period in time. And this novel brings this trauma, this expulsion, this questioning of identity down to an individual level, because although, of course, there's books talking about this expulsion, they're more on a society kind of scale. But Hafsa Zayyan, she takes it up at an individual level, and I have to say she actually does it very well. Really, really feel for Hassan at this point. It really does get you to think about what are we when it comes to who are we rather, when it comes to not just our core, but there's so many things going into identity that if your identity is never shaken by trauma, you don't really question it too much. If you're still within that community which shields you, you don't really have to question your identity too much if you believe in the things that the community are a part of. And this is what this is about. It's she in her political when she talks about political violence and personal trauma, she's talking about how friendships are broken and the homes become abandoned and the future becomes much different from how you thought it was going to be. It becomes rewritten. It's forced to be rewritten. And you just do, at some point, you just have to follow the stream. But at some point, you also have to be able to move in a direction that you can help yourself if it's possible. The book also takes up how cultures, even though the people themselves move from country to country. That's why I think it's called We're All Birds of Uganda, and that statement is written in the book. A person can move from one country, their own country, like Hassan did. Hussein, sorry, I've probably been calling him Hassan and he's called Hussein, moved from India and came to Uganda and adopted it as his new country. But he himself, even if he became a boss of his own company and was doing well, he himself had workers who were Ugandan born, black Ugandans, even though Ugandans are black, but for the sake of this, we'll say black Ugandans, who he could never quite see as being able to work side by side with him at the same level, because for him, the Ugandan workers, were beneath him. So this is in spite of moving to a country which wasn't his own country. He doesn't quite accept the people at the same level or help them rise up at the same level as him. The book takes up this kind of hypocrisy. And the other thing that Samir also saw, Samir, the protagonist, also saw as hypocrisy is that's another thing that the book takes up is within India culture, there is still this thing that marrying a black person or marrying someone who's not Indian is never quite the same. Absolutely, there's probably the thing that if you marry someone who's white British, it's more acceptable, as Hafsa Zayyan says in here, because Samir has a relative who married someone who's white, and the family accepts the white person. But if it was someone who's black, it would not be accepted. So for Samir, this is part of another hypocrisy that he sees both exists with his own immediate family and in the time of Hussein's when he was in Uganda. So the book also takes up this, and part of the reason I think she took this up is because the author, is because she herself is half Asian Indian on her mother's side and half African on her dad's side, who comes from Nigeria. This I just read by the by and didn't read too much in it, so I can't really tell you what her views were on this, but she wrote about this. So that might be one reason why she took it up in the book. Or might just be. But any which way, I have to say this, as I said, book well worth reading. Her writing style is very easy, very accessible to read, but nonetheless, it keeps you going. It's good that it's not a very long book, I felt, because at this point, I do want to read books that don't take me forever. So this one was a very good choice. And I truly enjoyed this book. It's not a loud book. I think she writes quietly, if you can say that. But at the same time, she holds your interest. It keeps you going. She has something to say, and you hear it, even though it's not loud. I guess that's what I mean. She has something to say, and she says it in a very calm, thoughtful way, where you are forced to think about it if you don't always think about it, but also realizing that these are everyday struggles. I guess that's what also makes it accessible. These are everyday struggles, while at the same time she also handles the timelines, the two different timelines, in a very good way. There is none of this detachment that can happen, or fragmentation that can happen between different timelines. Another thing that I enjoy about this is that her main characters, it's easy to follow. Sometimes when you have several characters, I sort of lose my way and I forget who's who. Admittedly, this can be because some of the names are a bit harder to remember if they're foreign names. That can be the case. But in this case, you follow her characters very easily. I think she interwove the past and the present very well. And she managed to also describe Uganda with warmth and complexity. You read when she reads about, when she names Hussein, writes about Hussein, when she writes about his struggles in Uganda when during the time of the expulsion, she describes it with so much compassion. You really feel his suffering, really. And she it's not complex. She doesn't make it complex, but the way she writes it, she really do feel what he's going through. And this book becomes very relevant even today because it talks about migration, which we understand so many people are forced to move and so many people are forced to try and make a new home in a different country. Migration, integration, segregation, nationalism, and who gets to decide where they belong. We see what's happening around the world, and we see that even now people are without a choice, are being forced out of a place that they thought was home after 20, 30 years, and they're forced to move out, and I'm sure they're also questioning these things. So a very relevant book even now. It's not very old, by the way. It was published, it was written in, I can't actually find it. I'll have to put it in the description. But anyway, it's not a very old book. So that one, well worth a read.